We return now to the Protestant Reformation and the effects. One of the biggest reasons that historians and other humanistic scholars have associated Protestant culture, Protestant religion with greater freedoms and liberties was the fact that at its core, Protestantism is somewhat democratic. Martin Luther said that you do not need to listen to the Catholic Church, which basically means you don't have to respect the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. You don't have to respect the priest as leaders. And Martin Luther proclaimed a priesthood of all believers, which does trend in a democratic direction. Basically, we as members of the congregation, we as members of the church, our voice is equal to that of the Pope. Our voice is equal to that of the priest. And so this is essentially demolishing the justification for the Catholic Church's hierarchy. Now, this was not the intention of Luther. Luther was not democratic. In fact, he was pretty elitist. And you could see Martin Luther's elitism when it came to the Great Peasants' Revolt. The Peasants' Revolt was the most radical direction that reformers took the Protestant Reformation in. Many of them were inspired by Martin Luther's criticism against Catholic hierarchies and Catholic abuses. In the 1520s, numerous peasants in Germany rise up against their rulers. They demanded the return of their traditional rights, which they felt the aristocracy had deprived them of. They also criticized the hierarchy and leadership of their political societies. They demanded an end to serfdom and believed that serfdom, having peasants ruled over by a feudal lord, violated the spirit of Christianity. These ideas spread through pamphlets which called for political, social, and spiritual reform. Crowds of poor people banded together to burn down monasteries, to burn down buildings. In fact, it was Europe's largest and most widespread rebellion before the French Revolution in the 18th century. One of the most radical leaders of the German peasants was Thomas Müntzer. Müntzer was originally a Catholic and originally a follower of Luther. He was attracted to Luther's critiques against the Catholic Church. But nonetheless, Müntzer did not agree with all of Luther's views. In particular, Müntzer did not like the fact that Luther was elitist and did not want to carry the Protestant Reformation to what he believed was its logical conclusion of demolishing the social hierarchies. And so therefore, Müntzer traveled around Germany spreading his ideas. Müntzer preached of a coming era in which the poor and downtrodden will rise up, destroy the rich, and create a new social order in which everyone was equal, in which everyone had a say in society. Many historians regard Müntzer's vision for society to be a sort of communistic theocracy. And in fact, we could see Müntzer's beliefs with his quote, "Everyone should properly receive according to his need. Any prince, count, or lord who refuses to do this, even when seriously warned, should be hanged or have his head chopped off." Now, Müntzer attempted to bring his worldview into reality. He organized, he created a so-called Christian League, and he believed that this Christian League should represent the desires and wishes of the people. But this Christian League was a militia. It was an army with an ideology. One of the most important things for Müntzer was pain and suffering, because he believed that pain and suffering brought you to Christianity, that you needed to experience pain and hardship to make you resistant to spiritual corruption and given into your own desires. But nonetheless, ideas of equality and poverty were central to Müntzer's worldview. He believed that the Catholic authorities had become corrupt and were responsible for the suffering and misery of the poor. Müntzer was building an army. He was building a revolution. He instructed his followers to bear the sword against their rulers. Müntzer told his disciples that their goal was revolution, their goal was change, that their goal was to destroy the rich, their goal was to carry this revolution out, and their goal was to transfer power to the people. And Müntzer believed that this would create a more godly order. Now, of course, German princes eventually have enough of Müntzer's worldview, and they ruthlessly cracked down on the Christian League. They moved in and swiftly attacked Müntzer's forces in the Battle of Frankenhausen. Müntzer himself was captured, tortured, and then eventually executed. Now, Luther stood by and sided with the princes. Luther denounced the peasant movement and recommended that the German princes should use restraint when crushing the peasants' movement. Nonetheless, Luther's ideas were radically democratic, even though he himself did not intend it to be so. Luther's goal was just to return to the original Catholic Church in which the disciples in Christ met each other as equals. And in fact, Many historians have noted that this idea of democracy or self-rule has its origins in the early days of the Christian community, of the early days of the Christian church. Particularly, it was the Christian ideals of love, hope, and charity which laid the foundation for ideas of equality and democracy. At its core, Christianity holds that each individual, because of their soul, is valuable. Every soul embodied in every human being has the potential to be good, to become closer to God. In fact, the Western tradition of social justice comes from the church, comes from the early Christian community. Early Christians stressed the need to care for the poor, charity, of looking out for the lowliest members of society. Christians commanded each other to look after those in need. And so the Christians believed that no one should be excluded from the community. Christians welcomed the worst members of society, the tax collectors, prostitutes, to join in on their new religion. And indeed, this ethos is embodied with the idea that you should love your neighbor as yourself. The disciple Paul routinely stressed that Christians should be humble, they should be meek, they should be understanding, they should show humility, they should show patience. Now, this ethos of all members of society being a spiritual brethren, spiritual member, was carried forth throughout the centuries. Augustine of Hippo, or St. Augustine, was an important church member who wrote of these ideas. He imagined a perfect community, a so-called city of God. And Augustine described the city of God as a place where, quote, all citizens serve one another in charity, whether they serve by the responsibilities of office or by the duties of obedience. And indeed, Augustine recommended humility and humbleness in place of honor and vanity. And historians argued that these Christian beliefs, these Christian virtues laid the culture and practices that formed the foundation in which later ideas of democracy were built upon.